Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. In line with its election promise of 100 trillion rupees investment in the infrastructure sector by 2024, the NDA government would be targeting low-hanging fruits such as metro projects, England waterways, natural gas grids and airport privatisation to give a fillip to the private sector investment in the first few months of its tenure. Getting private sector back in a big way would be the topmost priority since the government has a limited fiscal headroom. Fitch said in a May 24th report that reducing general government debt to 60% of the GDP ceiling by FY25 from the rating agency 68.8% of the GDP in FY19 would require a significant deficit reduction of about 0.5% of the GDP annually. The government's own budgetary support would therefore be largely limited to creating infrastructure support for agriculture, IT in education and digital networks for its social outreach programs. The road sector, however, would have to continue to depend on borrowings and budgetary resources like the railways. The last 5 years have seen massive spending in roads, railways, water, irrigation and urban infrastructure. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyse the new government's thrust on infrastructure. Joining me on the program today are A.K. Bhattacharya, Editorial Director of the Business Standard, Bhanuchandar Nagarajan, former consultant, the World Bank, Washington, D.C., and K.T. Ravindran, Rick's School of Built Environment. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Bhattacharya, I'd like to begin the program with you. So what do you believe this new government's thrust towards infrastructure is going to be on?
Well, I think going by the BJP's poll promise, which is captured in the Sankalp Patra, as you rightly pointed out, that the new government will have to give a renewed focus to more investment in infrastructure, and in monetary terms they expect that by 2024 100 lakh crore or 100 trillion rupees will have to be invested in the infrastructure sector. So that's the target. So clearly there's a lot of money is going to be pumped into the system, but there are two challenges that I see. One is that the bulk of this money will have to come from the private sector, because the government's own resources, going by the track record of any government for that matter, in the last 5 years particularly, has been a very small amount of money relative to the requirement has been given. For example, if you look at the government's own capital expenditure, which has grown by an average annual growth of 10% each year in the last 5 years. So it reached a level of 9.61 lakh crore. This includes capital expenditure, which is the capital budget, plus the public sector's internal and external budgetary borrowing. So if you look at the total capital expenditure, which largely goes into building of infrastructure and capacity, the amount that was spent last year was 9.61 lakh crore. The government's expenditure, quite ironically, actually for the current year in the interim budget, which I'm sure will be revised, has actually seen a decline to 9.51 lakh crore. Now, if you want to raise the 9.51 lakh crore to 100 lakh crore in the next 5 years by 2024, which is the promise, it will require an annual average growth of 60% every year. So clearly, government alone cannot meet this expenditure requirement. What you need is adequate private sector support for each of your key infrastructure sectors, which is, as you rightly pointed out, public transport, you have got water, you have got aviation, you have got railways, and in my view, we often ignore the social infrastructure areas of education and health, because they are also very, very important infrastructure areas if you want to make India a truly global force by the end of 5 years. So therefore, this amount is clearly not going to be enough for your total goals as such. If you want to meet those goals, the government alone cannot meet this requirement because of the fiscal consolidation requirements. That money has to be found out, and at the same time the private sector is going through a major capital shortage, So my sense is that if the infrastructure strengthening goal has to be achieved, it has to come from private sector, it has to come in large measure from the foreign investor,
Right.
and through a measure of incentives structure by which both the private investor and the foreign investor come in and they see long-term return to be part of the Indian infrastructure story, and that is the way forward to my mind.
Absolutely. Okay, so private sector investment really needs to be the focus area, is what you're suggesting. Banu, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. Private sector investment has been a problem area really over the last 5 years. So do you believe the thrust is going to be on that, and how does the government ensure that private investment kicks in like it should?
Okay. The Prime Minister is in one of his campaign speeches said that the aspiration is to make India a $5 trillion economy by 2024. If that has to happen, it would be built on the shoulders of strong physical infrastructure and consequent higher human capital. If you look at the first term of BJP, the most of the infrastructure achievements, the great achievements have been in the road sector and the power sector. The Prime Minister also has said that, like, in the first 5 years, we worked on catering to the expectations of people. अपेक्षाओं को पूरा करने के लिए काम किया है. The next 5 years, like, we will work towards fulfilling the aspirations of people. आकांक्षाओं का पूरा करने के लिए. So if you look at the basic expectations, it is basically Bijli Sadak Pani, in which, like, Bijli, everybody knows about the 99% electrification, and in fact, like, it has actually reaped very good political dividends for the BJP as well. In a state like Bihar, in which it was implemented very well, the consequent increase in sales of air conditioners and electric fans and the consequent build-up of the economy has helped very well. Sadak, like, 150,000 kilometers of rural roads have been built, 30,000 kilometers of highways have been built.
Never seen before speed.
Never seen before.
Have been constructed in.
Yeah, I think it was around 27 kilometers per day last year. So great achievements, but in the Apeksha bucket, there is one thing that was left, is Pani, and which rightly finds its place in the manifesto. In fact, the professed goal is to give Nal Pe Jal to all households by 2022, the 75th year of independence. So that is going to be one of the major thrusts for the next 5 years. Second is coming to the Akansha bit, which is going to be aspirational. The focus will be mostly, I think, on building, like, metros, electrification of trains, and building new airports. Like Mr. Bhattacharya was saying, to fulfill all this, you need, like, the 100 lakh crore, which the number has caught the imagination of almost all infrastructure analysts and everybody. For that, like, you need private sector. And Professor Kelkar has come up, the Kelkar committee was set up to review infrastructure financing by the private sector in 2015, and he came up with a report, and the private sector seems to be, like, very gung-ho about it, which calls for, like, coming back of the private sector, as they say, because, like, in the second half of UPA 2, there were a lot of PPPs that took off, but, like, most of the infrastructure that was built in Modi 1 was mostly government funding. They actually, like, in fact, like, in the highway sector, there was a method called the TOT, toll operate transfer, which actually garnered around 9,000 crores in one of the auctions. Basically, what they do is, like, the government builds infrastructure, and then, like, then the private sector is called to operate it, okay, by tolling, for which they get an annuity. Anyway, let's not go into the details, but there is huge interest in brownfield projects in India, especially from foreign investors. How we actually bring it and execute it is going to be the challenge. See, private sector infrastructure itself is, like, a very quirky industry, because there is actually a huge, if you take financing, there's a huge asset liability mismatch, because most of the banks fund it, which have, like, short 3-year, 5-year, 7-year deposits, but the infrastructure projects go on for, like, 20 years, 30 years. So then land acquisition is an issue. So there are so many issues and so many bottlenecks, which is natural. It's not unique to India. It's a phenomenon world over. How we actually tackle all these to, like, take care of the Apeksha bit
Right.
is going to be the challenge for the next government.
Sure, sure. Professor Ravindran, I'd like to bring you to the picture now. As far as urban infrastructure is concerned, what is the focus going to be and what are the challenges really?
Well, as far as we can see now, there are these 4 or 5 major core areas that is already described by him. Road, rail, then there is water, internal waterways, then there's air, and these are the basic things which service an urban area. Now, that's talking about the larger picture at the national level coming into the cities. But within the city itself, what we need is more and more public transport, and rightly the investment has already started flowing in that direction. But basically, when you look at the larger picture, unless you have profit to be made or light at the end of the tunnel, say 15 years, 20 years time, when the recovery time is built in, no investment can be expected from outside to come and put in money there. And it's like a chicken and egg situation. If you don't have the infrastructure, you cannot do proper urbanization. If you don't have urbanization, you don't require the infrastructure. So this is the balance that needs to be achieved between the investments in infrastructure and the demand for in cities or in new settlements from where that money can be recovered. Now, this is a balance that has not yet been attempted. It's not only about projecting how much money you require to be put into a certain sector. It's about how do you recover that money as well. And that recovery process has a very direct impact on quality of life in cities. And I think that's an area where we will require to do more and more focus. If you look at the internal waterways system, which has been, it was a brilliant idea to actually connect all the ports through waterways, because it doesn't mean building huge road networks or railway connections and so on, but it merely meant planning in such a way that you converge the points of infrastructure at city level to the port areas, and then from there link other ports. This is a very well conceptualized framework, but its progress has been very tardy.
Sure.
Especially because from what I know, the response from the government towards even at a planning stage, the response from the government has been slow.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Mr. Bhattacharya, a couple of aspects now. First, of course, on this whole project of river linking. Now, this is something that was a pet project of the former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. It probably has not been taken forward the way he would have liked it to. Do you believe the thrust and the focus is going to be on that now, since several of the other aspects have been, at least addressed? That is one. Secondly, on urban planning and city-specific planning, a lot was said about the smart cities and so on and so forth. Where has that reached, and do you see extra focus on that front?
I think the river linking project is an ambitious project. It has made some headway. We have seen the first river linking project being completed in Madhya Pradesh, and it has led to some improvements. The navigability aspect is being explored now. So I guess this will be a slow and steady. This is a sector that will see a slow and steady progress. But then there are environmental issues, because when you are doing this river linking, you are in many cases you are changing the course of that river, and probably this will have adverse environmental impact on the ecology. So therefore we have to be cautious, but at the same time this is something that China has done very well. Even US has experimented with that. So there is no reason why we should not experiment it, but with caution. Having said that, the larger point that you referred to is that there is need for investment. Now, when you require that money to be pumped into this infrastructure sector, you need to first ask this question: where will that money come from? Now, it cannot come from the exchequer because the government is stretched. No, it has to come from either the private sector or the foreign investor. Now, the private sector and the foreign investor may not bring in the entire capital that is required. they need to be supplemented. And that is where you need a kind of a financial sector innovation by which you can meet the requirements of the infrastructure sector. What I mean is this, that when 1990s, when the financial sector reforms were initiated, we very soon from the 1990s end, we saw the obliteration and decimation of what we call the financial institutions. We used to have financial institutions which used to excel in the idea of long-term financing. Long-term financing is an idea which addresses the problem that my colleague here mentioned about asset liability mismatch, that you draw money from the market over a period of 3 to 5 years, but you have to service a project which is a gestation period of 15 years maybe. So there is an asset liability mismatch. So with the demise of the long-term financial institutions, every bank became an agent for long-term financing. And I think this was a flaw in the system. So my sense is that if you want to give a push, the necessary push to infrastructure financing, you need to probably revive or create an agency for infrastructure financing which can take upon itself the responsibility of funding these long-term projects by raising long-term money and investing in long-term projects. Right now, what is happening is the most of the universal banks are raising short-term money for long-term projects, which is why you have seen the classic, the NPA problem, where a large number of banks which had invested in the infrastructure sector are now stuck with sticky loans.
Right.
Now, therefore, you need a novel infrastructure financing instrument, and I would recommend very highly that we need to create a long-term infrastructure financing agency which can take care of India's huge infrastructure requirements. I don't think incentive is an issue here. I think we have a tolling system for various infrastructure projects is in place. So therefore, if you need to focus on infrastructure in the same way as you would like to for the growth of the Indian economy, for urbanization, then I think it is time that we looked at this financing agency which can take care of India's financing needs.
Sure. Your thoughts, Banu, on an infrastructure financing agency, and how do we ensure that, the whole sector as a whole, if you look at it, is made more attractive?
Actually, this idea of having an infrastructure agency has been going around. The thought has been going around for a while. I think the time has come because, what he mentioned, there's a tenfold gap between the budgetary expense for infrastructure and the aspiration of 100 lakh crores. So obviously, the money has to come from outside. But many times what happens is when you create an infrastructure agency and they actually give away the money to various projects. Each project has a different project risk profile. So usually there are issues with that. How we actually it actually, as they say, the devil is in the details. So how they actually work through that is something that is waiting to be seen. One aspect when we talk about infrastructure that we don't talk about actually when we talk about infrastructure is municipal infrastructure. We actually talk about roads, ports, water supply and all. So municipal infrastructure actually has visible impact for the people and for the politician. Okay, if you actually have a proper sewerage line which is very visible on the road, right, very much like roads. So I think there's going to be a thrust on water and sewerage as well. For that, to enable that, you need more foreign money coming in as well. In fact, the RBI has I think recently announced easing of norms for foreigners, foreign investors to come and invest in municipal bonds, Moonies as they're called. So for example, the Indian municipal bond market is around 500 million, while in the US it is $3.5 trillion. So you can look at the scale. So there's
a huge opportunity there.
There's a huge opportunity. In fact, many municipalities, for example Pune, Chennai, they have actually kind of used that route to finance their infrastructure. So that is one huge opportunity that is waiting to be tapped.
So self-financing, basically, as far as some of these municipals are concerned.
Yeah.
All right. So, Professor Ravindran, talking more specifically about municipal infrastructure, are there any best practices, any pilots that we can probably implement, that we can follow, to see a success story?
Well, there has been some success story in Surat, that there has been a a pretty good mechanism by which the municipality enriched itself through proper taxation and proper collection and so on, and they've gone into investing quite a bit into urbanization and development. The far and few municipalities in India have actually been able to do it, because at the municipal level we have the least amount of capacity to either plan economically either plan in economic terms or in planning in physical terms. That's one of the reasons why the smart city mission has not really taken off, because the municipal level there isn't the capacity to do so. So unless we in fact can improve the capacity at the local level, none of the projects are really going to take off if your target finally for recovery cost is at the city level. Now on top of it, we also have a situation where we don't have an urbanization policy at all. The last policy in place was in 1988. We don't have a new policy in place. We have some kind of a paper outlining how to improve local areas within cities and so on, which have been now kind of going around as the possible plan, but that's still quite insufficient to be able to meet the requirements of the municipalities. If you look at what happened to Smart City Mission itself from the broader perspective, it began first as a 100 new cities program. Now, where are these 100 new cities going to be? There was no plan. Okay, so very soon they decided that they'll have to actually revise this 100 new cities and turn them into 100 existing cities. Yeah? Now, at 100 existing cities level itself, they soon decided that the city itself is too big an entity to plan, so we need to have an area-based development. So the territorial identification of the investment for smart cities were brought down from 100 new cities to 100 existing cities to now area-based development.
Right.
That area-based development also has not been able to take off too well. But one important point that is connected with infrastructure is the fact that our cities are also large centers of distribution of goods, particularly of agricultural produce. There are these big mandis, big wholesale markets and so on, where trucks and other things move towards these cities. That's why all the infrastructure comes in there. And then it is again disbursed from there locally as well as regionally.
Right.
So there is a regional network of infrastructure which is required to service each city. You know? And while we've been talking about smart cities, we have not looked at smartening our public collection and distribution system of agricultural produce.
Right.
So
right.
if we are able to bring in smartening of that infrastructure, that is the virtual infrastructure,
Sure.
We will see a much better distribution system, much less loss due to transport, which is huge now, to storage and transport. There's a huge loss, mostly in terms of perishable goods as well. And we'll find better distribution system. Our public distribution system can be improved hugely if the PDS system is subjected to smartening.
Absolutely.
So instead of looking at smart city or smart area development as the targets, we should also shift focus towards improving, smartening these systems which actually service the city and make a city what it is.
Absolutely.
It will have great impacts on the kind of profit recovery for the farmers.
Right.
It will cut out quite a lot of middlemen. It will bring down the prices of agricultural produce. Sure. It has multiple benefits,
Absolutely.
but we have not looked at it as yet.
Okay.
So smartening the infrastructure, that
Right.
is distribution and recovery system, is a critical factor that should go into the next phase.
Okay, closing comments now from all my guests. Limited time, so I'm going to ask you to be brief. Starting first with you, Mr. Bhattacharya, taking the points that were made by Professor Ravindran forward.
I think Mr. Ravindran has really hit the nail on the head. We need to smarten the infrastructure to derive the full benefits of smart infrastructure. But my larger point here would be that a time has come where we have to look at the financing flows, the source of this financing afresh, underline the need for a long-term financing institution, and at the same time, if we want to get the municipal bond idea working, which is a brilliant idea in my view, but then we also need to look at the tariff structure, in what way those municipal systems, whether it is a sewerage clearance, whether it is the water supply, or whether it is the electricity supply, those things will be able to attract municipal bonds and foreign investor only when that investor sees that there is a recovery mechanism, there is a viable, credible tariff structure by which instead of these becoming a toll on the system, this becoming a drag on the system,
right,
they should be able to recover that money. In other words, you need a proper financing source, but you also need a proper source for recovering that services that you offer through a proper tariff structure,
right,
by which you don't need implicit or non-transparent subsidies in the system.
Sure. Banu, a word on rural infrastructure, because that's something that we've not really stressed on.
Okay, so both in urban and rural infrastructure, one of the things like that's actually our Achilles heel is the maintenance of infrastructure. Roads in Mumbai are a classic example, right? We lay the roads and then it becomes like, you know, all potholes. So operation and maintenance of existing infrastructure is as important as building new infrastructure. For doing that, you need proper financing, proper development of human capacity, human resources, and use of technology, as my guests were mentioning. So a combination of this is important to maintain and, you know, not actually wither away the benefits of building costly infrastructure. When it comes to rural infrastructure, as I mentioned, rural roads and rural electrification are one of the success stories of the past. I think there is going to be like the same issue of maintenance. For example, you gave electricity connection to 2.62 crore people, right, through the Saubhagya scheme. So now, how are you going to like maintain that? Because right now there is, I don't know whether you're following that news in particular, because the power ministry is like blaming the state regulator for not actually doing the tariffs properly. The state regulator is blaming the distribution company for not reducing the transmission and distribution losses. Now like the debt is almost like pre Uday scheme. The discom is the debt level is pre Uday scheme. So like ultimately there is some fundamental reform that needs to be carried out. So how, I'm sure like the government is aware of this problem and they're going to do something about it
and address it in the next few days or years is what you're suggesting. Yeah, very quickly, Professor Ravindran, your concluding remarks on the program.
Well, I think as far as the urbanization sectors, which is my area of expertise, so I'll like to comment more on that. There has also been a crossover which was attempted during the earlier NDA regime. It was called PURA, P-U-R-A. That means provision of urban infrastructure in rural areas. And it was something which was championed by our President Abdul Kalam as well. And there was quite a lot of research that was done at that time as to how this can be done. Some of it very marginally has been implemented in Maharashtra and very successfully, which means taking the social infrastructure which is missing in cities, in villages, that is hospitals, education centers, basic larger level goods transaction centers like, you know, big shopping areas and so on, which are not available in the rural areas, have to be taken to the rural area by creating a set of loops which will connect the highways to each rural settlement. So clusters of settlements have to be identified,
right,
and a Pura center has to be established.
Sure.
This was a mission which was initiated during the first NDA regime time, but was never carried forward. Now I think it is time for us to look at that,
revive it and take
take it forward, because that can also help stem the urban, rural-urban migration to a large extent.
All right. With that, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Several points there coming out of this particular debate about what should be, the move forward as far as the infrastructure is concerned. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.